You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 361 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. And no, I didn't accidentally re-upload Monday's episode again, but Monday I did say 361, which was actually episode 360. I don't think it really matters much anyways, since I don't put the episode numbers on the show titles anymore, and I just update current events Monday, Wednesday, Friday every week. And so it's not like, back on episode 3, I covered this particular subject. I just cover what's in the news on every show, which is why y'all need to subscribe to it somewhere and don't miss a single episode. That way you get the most out of it. Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, everywhere I've found to put the podcast, I've done so. If there's somewhere that you like listening to podcasts and it's not up there, email me and I'll get it up there. Also, I'm restructuring my Patreon tiers and doing some different stuff with that. I'm going to start doing a monthly live stream, letting people join a Google Hangouts who donate to the show and basically ask me questions. If nobody shows up, I'll talk to myself for an hour and then I'll upload it to the rest of you. So you could donate to the show, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. And last is, of course, what you need to do is share the show to get it out there to new listeners, or just recommend it to somebody. Say, hey, this is really great. It's probably actually better to get somebody listening just clicking the share button on Facebook. But anyways, if you do that, Libertarian Institute is the best place to find my show and my daily news roundup. Both are featured in the right-hand column on the homepage of that website. Getting into the news here, Congress, and right now at the committee level, is starting to put together the National Defense Authorization Act. This is passed every year to fund the Pentagon, and I think Congress views this as one of the ways they exercise their congressional powers and influence over American foreign policy. So sometimes debate around this bill comes down to funding for different weapons projects or something like that. How much goes into some of the congressional slush funds and the defense discretionary spending accounts, where they're able to be pretty fast and loose with what they're doing with that money. And then there's also different powers that are given either to the president or different people in the NDAAs. So famously, I think it was the 2012 NDAA that Obama signed that gave him the power to indefinitely detain American citizens. So this is something, terrible that was in it. This year, I think there's a couple bright spots we could look at. The first is that the Democrats are trying to put together something for the NDAA to prevent Donald Trump from having the authority to send any more new detainees to Guantanamo Bay. Now, of course, it's probably been close to 10 years now that we actually sent anyone to Guantanamo Bay as far as detainees go, and a lot of those there have left. But the base hasn't been shut down yet. Of course, it has the legacy of being a torture prison, and in a lot of ways likely still is for the people that are there. Whether in a sense they deserve it or not, it's a different question. But, some of these people are just absolutely terrible, and I think there's still some people who are more or less innocent that are still held at Guantanamo Bay. But Trump has floated the idea of sending new detainees to Guantanamo Bay. And right now we have a very complicated situation in Syria, where there's a whole bunch of foreign fighters being held by the Syrian Kurds. They really don't want to, put these guys through their justice system. I don't know if they're more inclined to either let them go versus just hang them. Iraq seems to have just found the solution that their plan is to sentence all of them to death. And, we'll see if different governments come to the aid. I've, been talking about on the show how Iraq has, I think, plans to now execute 12 or 14 French citizens who fought with ISIS. Or I should emphasize, accused of fighting for ISIS. I don't know how many of these guys are actually diehard ISIS members versus somebody who was maybe misled into, think he was supporting a more moderate opposition and then ended up getting captured by somebody and paid ransom to somebody else. I mean, these kind of crazy things happen. So it's not clear to me that all these people are guilty, deserving the punishment of death, but maybe some of them are. Anyways, there's Americans held by the Syrian Kurds. What the Syrians are going to do with those Americans is a big question mark. 6 Americans, I believe, actually came home this week. These are women and children, though, so these weren't the actual ISIS fighters themselves. Rather, their wives and children, who I'm assuming in these cases were found to be unwilling accomplices of their husbands. So, they didn't want to go there, but because of the way culture and potentially force worked in the situation, the women felt obligated to go. There, their husbands go, die for ISIS. Eventually, they get captured by the Syrian Kurds. They never, were really the jihadist types. They're not going to go blow themselves up in Times Square. And hell, maybe, they even vote for Hillary Clinton or something crazy like that. So I'm not surprised that some of these people will come home. But what to do with, Americans who are true jihadists, went to Syria, probably committed horrific acts of war crimes and stuff like that. I mean, ISIS was absolutely brutal to the civilian populations. And if maybe let go in the United States, would just take a gun down to his local mall and start shooting people till a cop shot him. There's some, real crazy kind of coots out there. And so what to do with these guys is a pretty complicated question. Not claiming to have all the answers here, but sending them to the torture prison probably isn't the best course. Just looking at the legacy of Guantanamo Bay, I think the best thing would be to shut it down, make it clear that the U.S. doesn't engage in torture, and then look to prosecute some high-ranking Trump or Bush administration officials for torturing people. Also, look at the Obama administration for essentially covering it up and letting it go. I mean, we're talking about crimes against humanity here. There were innocent people tortured in that prison and a part of that torture program, and nobody except the man who blew the whistle, John Kiriakou, was ever held accountable. But that tends to be how things work. Recently, we had the Pentagon announce that as a result of the botched raid in Niger that killed, I believe, 4 Americans, special operators in Niger, no senior officials will be held responsible. Now, in a sense, I'm not saying that a whole bunch of senior level officials were guilty of anything here, but nobody, above somebody who was maybe involved or right above their rank is held responsible here. And that's pretty disgusting. When you think about 4 Americans dying, what America would do if, let's say, an Iranian killed 4 Americans in the Middle East. I mean, we would go to war over that. But here we have 4 Americans dying in a country that Americans can't find on a map, have no idea why American troops should be there whatsoever, and nobody at a higher level or even in Congress is held responsible. I mean, Lindsey Graham admits that he didn't even know U.S. troops were there, probably couldn't find it on a map, didn't understand what the U.S. mission was, didn't understand that it was Obama and Hillary's war in Libya that destabilizes a huge region of Africa and just shoots jihadist terrorists across, that whole Sahel region of Africa. And now, we're not only fighting terrorists in Libya, but the governments of Burkina Faso and Mali and Chad and Nigeria are all battling these terrorist elements. It's quite insane how this all works. So wrapping up here, one of the other maybe provisions we'll see in the NDAA will be a resolution on Yemen of some kind, put in there that at least limits what the U.S. is doing with Saudi Arabia. Just waging an absolutely brutal war in that country. I've talked about Yemen a lot in recent shows, so I'm gonna go ahead and move forward because I got a lot of other stuff to cover. Trump has blocked cruise ships from stopping in Cuba. One thing that I thought was pretty interesting here is that all the media coverage on this is very juvenile-ish. It's all coverage of people tweeting, "Oh my God, I had this cruise to Cuba and now it's canceled." And maybe it gets a little bit more left-wing, like, I was going to Cuba to learn about the cultural heritage of the Cuban people, or even, of their ancestry or something like that. But now I can't go because of the mean, evil guy, Trump. But, there's really no attention paid here to the fact that we're cutting off, another kind of vital industry for Cuba, something that probably employs Cubans and helps, people improve their quality of life a little bit, having these tourists come into their country. And it's like all other times the U.S. applies any kinds of sanctions or embargoes. Sometimes, they care, oh, this is going to raise prices for Americans. If Trump does this action or that action, these tariffs or those sanctions or whatever. But nobody ever says, oh man, like this is actually going to hurt a lot of people in that country. And it just does all the good work that Obama did on Cuba. The guy does very little good stuff and Trump is trying to undo most of it seems. pretty big story out here, although I think it still has some room to develop, and I'm going to just cover it briefly on today's show. Apparently, Kim Jong-un's half-brother was going to meet with the CIA and had past contacts with the CIA on the trip to, I believe, Malaysia when he was executed by nerve gas. I believe it was Viet's gas, and there's 2 women that are held responsible for that, believed to be either hired assassins or agents of the North Korean state sent to kill the half-brother of Kim Jong-un. This is portrayed as a kind of ruthless move by Kim Jong-un to prevent anyone from being able to take over his throne. Maybe that's exactly what happened here, although the connection to the CIA certainly casts some doubt on it. And one thing I just want to reference back to, and this is one of the first things I ever covered on, I would say one of the first 5 foreign policy focus episodes, was that the assassination of Kim Jong-un's brother, or half-brother, was the excuse that Nikki Haley used to cancel all diplomatic meetings that were scheduled between the Trump officials and Kim Jong-un in the, kind of early days there. And so I'm not saying this is responsible, this is what causes fire and fury, but it's one of the early things going on that starts to, roll downhill, where U.S. and North Korean relations actually deteriorate at the beginning of the Trump administration. Of course, they've since improved, but just imagine had you not gotten the first year and a half or 2 years of the Trump administration filled with threats, and rather you start, right away with the Singapore summit. Like, that's the first thing that goes on. That it really changes things. All right, so some news about China, and I have a lot here actually. First is that there's some protests going on in Hong Kong, which I think it can be described as a semi-autonomous region that was, I believe until the 1990s, a colony of the UK, but was then given over to China. And they did so with an agreement where they maintained quite a bit of autonomy, including of their justice system and I believe economic system. But I can't break down all the details here. I'm not going to claim to know them. Anyways, a big part of this was that Hong Kong didn't have an extradition agreement with mainland China. And so apparently a new leader of Hong Kong is about to sign a law that would allow people from Hong Kong to be extradited to mainland China. This is seen by the people of Hong Kong as a real blow to their autonomy, and it's probably, more symbolic than just the extradition case. But I think Chinese justice system is known to be pretty brutal to dissidents, and this is probably why they're opposing it. Big protests coming out against it, estimated at about 250,000 people were at protest over the weekend. I think there's been some riot police deployed in response, and things seem to be heating up around this. The U.S. is definitely throwing their hat into the ring on the issue, kind of emphasizing the importance for Hong Kong to maintain its autonomy. Now, it seems to me that if the people of Hong Kong don't want to be ruled by Beijing, then they sure as hell shouldn't be. And they should give a big middle finger to the mainland and say that, we're just going to keep doing our own thing. And, we're not going to abide by laws that we see are unjust like yours. But at the same time, the U.S. has no business saying, and I'm sure if we start to get involved, it's going to be through, exercising some military drills or something like that on behalf of Hong Kong. That's certainly what, we've seen with Taiwan, as China has looked to exert, I actually think, more pressure over Taiwan, which is in a different interesting situation where it's definitely more autonomous than Hong Kong from China. It's I think an independent country as far as I could tell, minus the fact that a whole bunch of other countries don't recognize it as an independent country. The U.S. doesn't recognize it as an independent country. But at the same time, the U.S. sells Taiwan weapons when China doesn't want Taiwan to buy those weapons. And, this would be something of the equivalent, I guess, if the U.S. really believed that Taiwan was a part of China, to, maybe selling a whole bunch of tow missiles to Barcelona or something like that in defiance of Madrid. The U.S. has also maintained that if China tries to invade Taiwan and take it over, we would, go to war on behalf of the Taiwanese. Under the Trump administration, as I've documented on the show, that, we've seen an increase in U.S. sailing warships through the Taiwan Strait. We've seen an increase of weapon sales to Taiwan. and also higher level meetings between U.S. and Taiwanese officials. $2 billion in weapon sales looks like are getting approved by the Trump administration to Taiwan. These include over 100 A-1 Abrams tanks, over 1,000 tow missiles, and also a bunch of man-pads, maneuverable, portable, shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles. Tactically, don't know if it changes much. I tend to think it doesn't without, being a military planner or something like that. Just looking at the map, seeing what Taiwan is, being a small island off the coast of China, that China would probably just try to embargo and surround the island rather than actually do a ground invasion and deploy tanks, and there's going to be somehow a big tank battle, on Taiwan or something like that. I think missiles would probably play a bigger role in something like that than tanks. And that's why, in a lot of ways, I think tank production was really slowing down in the U.S. Because there tactically wasn't as much of a need for one. And so, why else would Taiwan buy the weapons? Influence, right? If Lockheed or whoever is making these tanks or tow missiles or man-pads knows that, you're going to get a $2 billion contract from Taiwan every 5 years for more, well, that's a pretty good incentive to keep Taiwan independent from China. And should China invade Taiwan, it would probably hurt your, budget sheet, right? Because now these are sales that you're definitely not going to get because China's not going to buy those weapons from you. And so what do? They lobby Congress to, have more weapon sales, deeper ties with Taiwan, maintain Taiwanese independence. They fund think tanks who write papers that say, oh, the most important thing in the world is for China not to take over Taiwan, because then, one of the big things they like to point to is that Taiwan is a leader in, I believe, like gay rights and kind of that Pacific area. And, that would be a rollback and a setback, different kinds of independence, stuff like that. Also, the Taiwanese people want to be free. Not that I think it should be defended by the U.S. military, but that does seem to be something kind of important, the freedom and the will of these people to be ruled by whoever the hell they want and not whoever the big country next door wants them to be ruled by. Trump also announced that he's thinking about putting more tariffs on Chinese goods. This time it's $300 billion, and I believe he said he would decide after meeting with the Chinese leader at the upcoming G20 summit whether to put these tariffs on or not. The bad news here is that I think this puts tariffs on pretty much all Chinese imports to the U.S., and the economic relationship between these two countries is extremely important, not just for the wealth of all of us who enjoy that China's better at making some things, the U.S. is better at making some things. We ship the goods across this giant Pacific lake between the two countries, and then we're able to sell them, cheap or, giving China high-tech stuff in their country, and everybody benefits and everybody wins, because that's why capitalism is great. Also has the effect of creating a whole bunch of incentives for the U.S. to not get in some kind of military conflict with China, because all these different companies and manufacturers and distributors have incentive to continue to trade with China. Selling billions of dollars to their country means that if the U.S. goes to war with that, you lose billions of dollars. It's a bad thing. And those kind of incentives are important. So let's hope that at some point here, Trump either wises up or China gives him enough of an out so that he could just roll back all these tariffs and things on the trade front can get back to normal between the U.S. and China. I read an interesting story about France saying that they're looking at what's going on in the Pacific right now and they want to be more involved. So with all the complexities in like the South China Sea and Taiwan, and also some issues, territorial issues between Japan and Russia about some islands right there. Not sure it's so great if France starts to get involved and looks to, exercise territorial claims or, assert authority for one country in the region or another. Overall seems like a bad thing. But just remember that there is some French imperialism. While I mainly focus on the U.S. empire, other countries are guilty of this kind of stuff too. I mean, look at everything I said about China. China is looking to exert more authority over territories like Hong Kong and Taiwan, also Tibet, that the local population doesn't want it. They want to have their own self-rule kind of thing and are forced to live under the rule of another country. So I'm reading stories and I haven't gotten like a very good summary of it yet. So this again is one I'm not going to talk about in a whole lot of detail just because I only want to say what I know. And that is, it looks like within Donald Trump's national emergency to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia, he also authorized some kind of plant to be built. I believe an American company would build a plant in Saudi Arabia to make some high-tech bomb parts. Now, I've kind of read this as they're making JDAMs, which are what turns what they call dumb bombs into smart bombs by putting advanced GPS systems on it, or is just like a component that would go into that, some kind of GPS component or something like that, just to put Saudi Arabia into the production stream of some of these weapons, kind of like countries did with the F-35 project. For example, Turkey makes parts of the cockpit for that country, or for that plane. The bad thing is that if we add Saudi Arabia into this supply chain, then, like Turkey, maybe they'll try to use it to wield influence over the U.S., and anything Saudi's influencing the U.S. to do probably isn't great for the U.S. people. And also, if this is more advanced and giving them, letting them just make JDAMs, having all this tech capability for Saudi Arabia is probably only bad for the people of Yemen, where Saudi Arabia is just waging absolutely ruthless war. And also, if Saudi Arabia can make them in their own country, then it's harder for the U.S. to shut them off and say, absolutely, you're not having any more of these bombs, because all you're doing is using them to kill Yemeni children. On the last show, I covered Turkey's plan to purchase the S-400 and how that's causing problems with the U.S. wanting to sell Turkey F-35s. The U.S. now says that the Turkish pilots currently in the U.S. are no longer doing any training missions. And so this is a step further than what I covered on the last show, where they said they weren't going to allow any more Turkish pilots into the U.S., but the pilots here would stay. Turkey put out a statement saying they've neutralized 43 PKK targets in operations in northern Iraq. The PKK, of course, is a Turkish Kurdish militia that fights, something, according to the Turkish group, the Turkish state, a terrorist operation against Turkey, where if you ask the Kurds, they would probably say, well, this is kind of our insurgency guerrilla force fighting for our freedom over the oppressive Turkish state. Don't know exactly where on that spectrum the truth lies, but it's somewhere in the middle. Anyways, the Turkish Kurds have been pushed out of Turkey in some places, and they now reside in mountains in northern Iraq. And Iraq, I don't think particularly likes the Turkish presence in northern Iraq, but they really can't do anything about it at this point. I think they struggle to maintain control over the Sunni lands, and Turkey carrying out some operations against Kurds in northern Iraq isn't really the top concern of the Shiite government in Baghdad. It's just not. So it looks like this operation is going to continue to go on for a while. We're about 2 weeks in now, and all we really have for reporting is what the Turkish government is putting out, which is, them saying they neutralized that amount of Kurds this week. Here's an important one on Iran, just because people are going to try to confuse the narrative here. The IAEA has come out and said that Iran has increased the rate that they are enriching uranium up to the same purity. So the confusing thing here is when somebody reads the headline, they think that Iran is enriching uranium to a more pure uranium, so they would take it from 3.6%, which is fuel grade, which is what they're allowed to do under the JCPOA, which is an additional safeguards agreement that Iran has agreed to abide by in exchange for sanctions relief. So essentially, all countries pretty much are part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which says that in exchange for promising never to make nuclear weapons, you have the ability to certain civilian nuclear technology. And I think you can enrich uranium up to about 20%, which is medical grade. Because the U.S. was so paranoid that Iran may one day make a nuclear weapon, they got Iran to agree only to enrich uranium up to 3.6% just for fuel grade. What Iran is doing is just making more uranium at 3.6%. At one point, they threatened to increase 400%. The IAEA didn't specify that's how far Iran went, or if they're just, 10%, 20%, just a little bit more. This is done through centrifuges that, they spin it down, not something that, was in your high school science lab, something much more complicated than that. But this is all the process that Iran could do, and then they're able to export this. My guess is maybe some of this is happening because of the U.S. crackdown and sanctions on Iranian oil exports, looking to generate more revenue. This is a way to do it. Iran also believes by the letter of the JCPOA that this is something that they're allowed to do. if the U.S. isn't complying by it because the international watchdog group, the NDAA, continues to certify that Iran is following the agreement and not doing anything to violate it, the U.S. is in violation of the agreement and eventually just left it by putting sanctions on Iran. Basically went back on their deal. So now Iran is still within the agreement with the European countries, Russia and China, but they are exercising, I guess, a little bit more nuclear fuel production now. All right, real quick, some updates from Africa from the past week. In Egypt, there was a dust-up between Egyptian security forces and claimed to be Islamic State forces in the Sinai Peninsula. An attack on a Egyptian security checkpoint killed 8. They killed 5 of the militia in a firefight there, and then they claimed to have hunted down and killed 14 other ISIS fighters later on. 19 people were killed, likely by ISIS in Burkina Faso. Again, this is another one of those Libyan war blowback situations. 95 civilians were killed in Mali, and this is the ongoing ethnic violence in that country. You have 2 different ethnic groups. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the names because I'll pronounce them wrong. But one's, I guess, more of a hunter group. The other one's more of a rancher group. And then some ISIS forces, again, this is blowback from the Libyan war, have joined up with one of the ethnic groups and start killing the other one. And now basically you have tribal warfare going on in that country. And it seems like a slow burning civil war almost at this point. All right, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for the week. Hope everybody's enjoying it. Share the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, my website's Immersion News. Foreign Policy Focus is on all the different podcatchers, so make sure you subscribe to the show somewhere. Leave a rating and review when you do, and then check out the Patreon page. Like I said, I'm going to start doing some live streams.